Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out you guys, I got another banger for you. But before I get into the details of this story, let me just address something that a lot of you have been asking about in recent comments. So there's been a lot of you in the comments asking about NF related content, or basically asking me if I could switch it up with a diversity of stories that doesn't just focus on the Mexican Mafia and southern based street gangs, something that I can clearly understand. And then along those same lines, there's also been the usual group of haters who seem to think that I'm putting out content on the Mexican Mafia and Sureño street gangs because I'm either infatuated with this movement or I'm just trying to somehow throw some political shade. You know, honestly, I'm not even going to waste my time responding to these types of comments because it's not only ridiculous, but it's obviously coming from people who don't pay attention to my stories and who've got way too much free time on their hands. Because anyone who's followed my channel for any length of time knows that I keep my stories respectful and that I don't use these stories as a sounding board to bash, disrespect, or throw any political shade towards anyone that I ever talk about. And as far as me being infatuated with that movement, come on man, you've got to be kidding me. Listen, sometimes I think people just talk because they like to hear themselves talk. But what it all comes down to is this. You know, aside from trying to spread the gospel to some of the young uneducated minds out there, I also put out the type of content that my viewers like and ask for. And it's as simple as that. In terms of business and running content that generates views, most of my viewers seem to gravitate towards the Mexican Mafia stories. So of course, that's what I'm obviously going to put out. Why wouldn't I? I mean, like I said, aside from putting this content out for the purpose of conveying a message to those that are uneducated and ripe for being misled, I have to do what makes sense in terms of making some type of income and what works best for my channel. I mean, the best analogy I could give you guys is like having an NFL network because you're an avid football fanatic and you like football. But when you turn on your TV, all that channel talks about is golf. Why wouldn't you give the viewers what they want and what they paid to see? So it's got nothing to do with me being infatuated or stuck on that movement. It's pretty ridiculous that anyone would even say something like that. You know, I personally don't care who I run stories about. I talk about the Aborigines or the Eskimos in Alaska if that's what my viewers wanted me to talk about. So I have no preference. I obviously know more about the NF than any other organization out there because I was a part of that organization for years. But again, when it comes to these stories, I have no personal preference. So for all those that don't have the brains or wherewithal to figure this out for themselves, it all comes down to personal preference and what makes sense from a business perspective. As far as diversifying my content, I'll start making it a point to begin switching it up and giving you guys both stories about the Mexican Mafia and the Nuestra Familia, so you guys get a combination of stories about both of these groups. You know, if I can catch a break and start investing more time in my channel, I'm also going to run AB, BGF, and both Crip and Blood stories as well. My overall objective is to just run good stories regardless of who it is, where they're from, or what organization they belong to. So hopefully this wraps up all the questions you guys have been sending me about diversifying the content. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into this next story. So usually when I run these kinds of stories, it's about a prison in the state of California. But this story right here is going to be a little different as it took place in a federal USP that I'm sure you've all heard about before in the past, USP Lompoc. You know, I'm not going to give you guys a history lesson on Lompoc, but just to kind of set the stage and talk a little bit about where this incident happened, let me give you guys a quick overview about Lompoc and what kind of FCI it is. So for those of you who've done federal time, you're already aware of this, but some of these federal prisons are literally like small cities. Seriously, aside from being massive complexes in comparison to some of the state prisons, a lot of these federal prisons have huge industries that generate a lot of revenue. It's a business. It's all part of corporate America. But Lompoc, specifically known as the Country Club, has huge large-scale agricultural operations that include its own prison dairy, a cattle ranch, and a meat processing plant. Imagine that. Lompoc makes its own milk and has its own meat processing plant. I always heard that they ate good in federal prison, and now I know why. So Lompoc actually processes the milk and meat and then provides and distributes it out to the broader federal prison system, all the other federal prisons in the country. And of course, it's the inmates who manage and employ these operations. State prisons, on the other hand, have similar industries where you can actually take and learn a vocational trade. But on the flip side of it, these industries also act as a valuable resource for something else that the inmates are always in need of: weapon stock. I mean, think about it. There's too many different kinds of vocational training that they offer to name them all. but when you consider the resources and the type of material that these guys are working with, the amount of weapon stock and contraband that makes it back out to the prison yards is mind-blowing. And there's always an abundance of it. Slabs of steel and all kinds of other pieces of metal stock. Anything that can be constructed into a weapon. I mean, when you have vocational training in welding, machine shop, HVAC, automotive mechanics, auto body collision repair, electrical, plumbing, and then one of the largest trades in the sector, building and construction maintenance, this gives you a general idea of what they have at their disposal. You know, in some of my past stories, I told you guys that some of the weapons that you see out there on some of these prison yards are pretty close to some of the knives that you have right now in your kitchen drawer. And it's not just because of the skill set and craftsmanship that the inmates are capable of manufacturing. It's also because of what tools and the kind of weapon stock that are readily available to them. Anyways, in the early afternoon of January 25th, 1989, an inmate at USP Lompoc by the name of Johnny Estrada, who's also known as Bones from Norwalk, was stabbed to death in the prison kitchen bathroom during his normal job as one of the kitchen's main leads. When this incident took place, Bones was a kitchen worker and was assigned to one of the main kitchen leads. Apparently, nobody ended up coming forward claiming that they seen the stabbing as it actually happened, but later after it came out, several inmates would claim that they seen another inmate named Richard Santiago, who also went by Chuco from Puente, enter the bathroom shortly after Bones and then emerged by himself a few minutes later. These same inmates that would later testify that after they seen Chuco come out of the bathroom, they seen him walk back into the kitchen and throw a metal object into one of the kitchen sinks. And later, when these inmates that testified about how they were sure that he threw a metal object into the sink, they claimed that they heard metal bounce off of metal and that it was consistent with whatever Chuco tossed into the sink. From that point, they said that Chuco then proceeded to wash a large item of clothing that appeared to either be a shirt or a pair of pants. And according to all these witnesses that would later testify, at the time, nobody had any reason to believe that Chuco had done anything wrong or any reason to assume that he might have been involved in Bones' homicide, which makes sense because obviously at that point, nobody was even aware of the fact that a homicide had even occurred. So prison officials found out about this fatal stabbing within an hour of it happening. Free staff and other kitchen workers found out about it when one of the inmates went to use the bathroom and discovered Bones' body curled up on the floor in a pool of blood. So since this was an obvious homicide, the facility captain called for an immediate lockdown of the whole prison. And the entire kitchen area was cordoned off with crime scene tape so that the investigative unit could begin conducting a full-scale investigation. I'll circle back and go into the intricate details about exactly what happened in a minute, but during the course of their investigation, the SIU, Special Investigative Unit, found an inmate manufactured weapon in one of the kitchen sinks and a damp sweatshirt on the kitchen floor by an exit door. The sweatshirt was stained with what appeared to be human blood. And later, after a criminologist processed the evidence and performed DNA swabs on the sweatshirt, it tested presumptive positive for the presence of human blood. So when something like this happens where they end up finding a body in prison and they don't already have another inmate dialed in as being a suspect or the one who was visually seen committing the homicide, they'll slam the whole prison down and they'll usually start by doing a massive shakedown. This consists of them going from cell to cell or block to block and conducting a search of the entire facility. And their objective is to find weapons, hot kites that might tend to shed some light on who might have been involved and why the homicide was committed, etc., etc. Anything that might point them in the right direction and give them an idea about what was involved. And in the course of doing this massive shakedown, they'll also do unclothed body searches, looking for any type of injuries on the inmate's hands, such as broken skin on the knuckles, or any other injuries that are consistent with being involved in some type of physical altercation. They'll do a full grid search going from cell to cell, and then they'll also search the common general areas of the prison, such as the yards, the buildings, the day rooms, the showers, the garbage cans, etc., etc. Anywhere where they believe the inmate or inmates that were involved might have hid or disposed of potential evidence. Also, not to get off track, but one of the slight differences about federal USPs and state prisons is some of the terminology state prisons use when referencing blocks, units, or tiers. Federal USPs refer to blocks, units, or tiers as ranges or a range. So instead of referring to a housing unit as a tier or a unit, they'll call them ranges instead. And I'm only making this point for the purpose of this story. I just want to make sure you guys know what I'm talking about if you hear me using the term range. Anyways, before I get into the actual details of what happened and why, I just want to finish telling you guys what other evidence they ended up finding, because this is actually what led to them identifying who was involved and how he was implicated. So aside from the weapon that they found in the kitchen sink and the damp sweatshirt that they found on the kitchen floor by one of the exit doors, they also discovered fresh cuts on one of the hands of one of the inmates when they were conducting the visual unclothed body searches. This inmate had several cuts on the knuckles of his left hand that looked like fresh nicks, and then he had a deep slice on the palm of his right hand. Injuries that he couldn't give a plausible explanation for. And of course, this inmate was Richard Santiago, Chuco from Puente. And here's the crazy thing about it. Up until that point, they didn't even know Chuco was involved and nobody had implicated him. But the discovery of this small cut on his knuckle is what got the ball rolling and is ultimately what put them on his tracks. So the last piece of critical evidence that they found that kind of sealed the deal for Chuco happened while they were searching some of the common garbage cans in showers on two of the ranges. In one of the garbage cans, they found a full set of bloodstained inmate clothes that was in a cell one range above where Chuco was housed, and other bloodstained clothing, a pair of boxers and socks, inside a shower that was on Chuco's range. This, together with some of the other evidence they found, was pretty compelling circumstantial evidence. Later on, they speculated in court that the clothing that was found on a range one floor above Chuco's was probably placed there by another inmate who was attempting to help him destroy or displace the evidence. And then later, the same criminologist that performed DNA swabs on the sweatshirt also performed a DNA test on the set of inmate clothing and subsequently determined that Chuco was among those only 2% of the population whose blood was consistent with that blood type. So now that I gave you guys the formalities and told you a little bit about the evidence that ended up getting Chuco caught up, let me walk you through the details of what happened and the reason why Bones was targeted in the first place. So in 1987, Chuco landed in the federal prison system with a 60-month prison sentence for federal drug and gun charges. And according to one of my sources, he was a very well-respected Sureño who had done some state time and had apparently put some work in. You know, I've talked about this before in some of my other stories, and although the ranking structure is a little different for Sureños who are elevated and recognized with some level of status, it's delegated a lot different than how the NF implements status for Norteños or NR members. And I mean this in the context of them not operating under a traditional paramilitary structure where you have different categories under a category system or titles like captains, lieutenants, commanders, etc., etc. You know, I'm not going to get too deep into it as it'll take me away from this story, but they do have ways of delegating and signifying status, which includes getting the shield tattoo blasted on them, and then also by them earning the title of being a camarada, meaning that you've proven yourself to be one of the Mexican Mafia's most steadfast and loyal believers. And it also indicates that you've proven yourself to be a potential future prospect for membership into the Mexican Mafia. You know, the same way that Nuestra Familia uses the NR as its league of future prospects, the Mexican Mafia embraces those that are considered to be camaradas in the same context. At any rate, I said all that to say that when Chuco landed in federal prison, he was already recognized as a camarada and was a self-proclaimed loyal believer of the Mexican Mafias. He was also considered to be an up-and-coming who was on the fast track to be inducted by an individual who was there with him in Lompoc. This guy's name was George Bustamante, who was also known as Lucky from Boyle Heights. Apparently, Lucky took a liking to Chuco, so much so that he took him under his wing and began grooming him up as a made man. And as far as Chuco was concerned, he was cocked and ready to go. This is what he had been waiting for. All the work, all the sacrifices, all the loyalty he invested in the movement for this organization was what he was striving for. In his mind, this was the biggest opportunity of his life, and this is what it all came down to. So he was ready and willing to do anything and everything that was required of him. And when given the opportunity, he was going to make the best out of it and shine like he was supposed to. You know, keep in mind, Chuco had already done a significant amount of state time, and he had worked under several Mexican Mafia members before in the past, so he wasn't blind and he was already somewhat seasoned. But being that Lucky was raising his hand for him and was essentially the one who was taking responsibility for him, he started schooling him as if he was working with a youngster who was still blind and didn't even know the basic fundamentals. And from my understanding, most of the indoctrination was done out on the yard, walking the track, or just whenever Lucky got small blocks of opportunity to groom him. And the reason why the majority of Chuco's schooling was done out on the yard is because they weren't cellies, which isn't unusual. I've actually seen it done both ways. But it probably would have been better for Chuco to have been celled up with Lucky, because then they would have had plenty of time to cover everything that Lucky wanted to cover. At any rate, Chuco was celled up with another individual named Carlos Sanchez, who also went by Sporty from Chicago. Sporty at one time was actually affiliated with the Latin Kings, a Hispanic gang out of Chicago, but after meeting several Mexican Mafia members and other sureños out of California, his loyalties began to change and he eventually became a Mexican Mafia sympathizer. So much so that he didn't think twice about ranking out on the Latin Kings and being known to be what's called a hood jumper. It basically means when you're already affiliated with one gang, but at some point you decide to fall out and reinvest your loyalties in another gang. But apparently nobody else, including Chuco, cared, and he was allowed to be part of their circle. And according to my source, he described the relationship between Chuco and Sporty as being close-knit. He said they had a solid bond and that they seemed to have had each other's backs to the fullest. They talked about everything that was going on in the cell. They got along with each other like cellies are supposed to, and when Chuco wasn't with Lucky getting gamed up, he was always with Sporty. And based on what ended up happening in this story, it's probably safe to say that maybe they were a little too close and that they probably invested too much loyalty in each other. My source, on the other hand, describes Sporty as a young, solid individual whose head and heart seemed to be in the right place. He carried himself well, he never questioned anything that was ever asked of him, and again, he was also a firm believer in the Mexican Mafia. In fact, Sporty would pose a lot of questions to Chuco about the Mexican Mafia, and more specifically about the specifics of schooling Chuco was getting from Lucky. And this is probably something that Chuco should have kept close to the hip, as this was between him and his mentor. But apparently Chuco trusted Sporty enough to tell him whatever he wanted to know. And he was also trying to prepare him for his future endeavors as well. So like Chuco, Sporty was also aspiring someday to be a made member himself. He had a family member that lived in California that was a member, and he claimed to have met several members that he got real close with in the system that were all reputable members as well. But one of the most important conversations that Sporty and Chuco would end up having pertained to the expectations and requirements of what a prospective member had to do in order to be baptized or Christianed into the Mexican Mafia. And Chuco basically gave him the blood in, blood out creed, or ideology that the Mexican Mafia strongly believes in. He told Sporty that you not only have to take the blood of a sworn enemy, but that you have to take that individual's life in the interest of the Mexican Mafia. That you basically have to bring them a body and make an ultimate sacrifice. And again, he explained to Sporty that the rules around this expectation were governed under very strict guidelines that were also very clear. That you couldn't just take a life out on the streets behind a personal beef or behind some hood politics and then come to prison and try to claim that body as your meal ticket. It didn't work like that. Chuco went on to explain that you had to take a life that was a designated target of the Mexican Mafias, and that your sole purpose for taking it had to be directly for the purpose of fulfilling the Mexican Mafia objective. So Chuco made it abundantly clear that you had to take a life and that it had to be for the Mexican Mafia's sole benefit. The unfortunate thing about this for Chuco is that this conversation apparently took place at the worst possible time ever. Right around the time when he was actually in the process of making his ultimate sacrifice and solidifying his membership. Because this is the thing, 2 weeks prior to the day when this incident occurred, Chuco and Sporty talked extensively about this policy and what it entailed. And Sporty was literally like a little sponge that asked a lot of questions and soaked up everything he was told. And for whatever reason, this particular topic seemed to pique his interest as he asked question after question. And coincidentally, at almost around the same time these conversations were taking place between Chuco and Sporty, Lucky just so happened to be in the process of waiting for word to come back, good or bad, on an individual named Johnny Estrada who also went by Bones from Norwalk. He had been under an investigation for some very serious allegations, stealing from the Mexican Mafia and being involved in a stabbing on another known member. So at that point, the investigation was already in its final stages, and Lucky was just waiting for confirmation on a green light. And when he would finally end up getting it, Lucky delegated Bones to be Chuco's initiation target that would complete his membership. So when Lucky advised Chuco that Bones was going to be his target and that this body would serve as his christening into the Mexican Mafia, all Chuco could think about for the next 2 weeks were different scenarios for taking his life and the extreme measures he'd be willing to take in order to complete the mission. And as it always does in these types of situations, Lucky's loyalty to Bones as a fellow Sureño dropped almost instantly. In fact, he no longer seen Bones as a human being, but instead, he now looked at him as an object. The only object that stood between him and his membership into the Mexican Mafia. And I think this right here is one of the biggest hypocrisies of this lifestyle. Having the ability to show genuine carnalismo and unity for your so-called fellow brothers in arms, but then, literally in the blink of an eye, you're able to muster up enough hate and deep content to stick a knife in that same individual's back when a green light is given. How does anyone explain that? It's a sham. It's all predicated on loyalty that was never there in the first place. But nonetheless, again, during those 2 weeks while Lucky and other Mexican Mafia members were formulating and fine-tuning the game plan to take Bones out, Chuco started opening up more to Sporty and what was to come and why he was doing it. Chuco basically told Sporty that he was going to be made right there in Lompoc and there was going to be a body soon in the coming weeks. Something he really had no business talking about. But he still broke protocol and exposed this to Sporty because he thought he could trust him. So as the day of the incident got closer, Chuco even ended up telling Sporty who his target was and exactly how he was going to hit him. All things that he would later come to regret, but he more than likely did this as a form of boasting and because he wanted that type of clout. But in the coming days, this is all Chuco thought and talked about. He allowed it to consume him. You know, from experience and from just seeing other individuals in similar situations, when you're getting ready to do something like this, it really does almost completely consume you. It's all you think about, and you become obsessed and fixated with these thoughts so much so that you actually start rehearsing what you plan on doing before you do it. You become fixated on the objective, taking this individual's life, and for some of these guys, they look at it as being the biggest and most important day of their lives. And the one thing that keeps replaying over and over in your mind is that you have to perform and that everything basically depends on the work that you put in. As the clock continued to wind down and the day of the incident got closer, 3 other individuals would also end up becoming to be pivotal parts of this story. The first one was an individual by the name of Courtney Murray, who was also known as Mountain from Ventura County, a white inmate who claimed he was affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood. You know, you've got to remember, even though it's kind of waned down over the years, back in these days when this incident took place in the late 80s, the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood had a strong, unbreakable, fierce alliance. And this wasn't just in the California prison system. This also transcended to the federal prison system as well. So when Mountain pulled up and landed on the yard, he was eventually introduced to Chuco and his cellie Sporty, who would both end up embracing him and becoming to be close associates. Mountain was also housed on the same range, so they would occasionally play pinochle with him and sometimes they would walk the track with him out on the yard. And they did this not only because they took a liking to him, but also because this was their way of letting it be known to all the other cars out there on the yard that Mountain was one of their close associates. You know, I feel like most of you already know what I'm talking about, so I don't have to get too detailed, but for those of you who might not know what a car is in terms of prison terminology, let me give you the short version. A car is basically a group segment that runs together on a prison yard. It could be designated by race, where you have the white car, the black car, the border brother car, etc., etc. Or it could be based on affiliation, where you have the Norteño car, the Sureño car, the Bay Area car, the Sacramento car, etc., etc. That's usually how it's broken up in state prison. But in federal prison, the cars are broken up by state or affiliation. For example, you'll have the California car, the Washington car, the East Coast car, or New York car, etc., etc. And then, like I said, it might also be based on affiliation, where you might have the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the DC Blacks, Tango Blast, the Latin Kings, etc., etc. So believe it or not, Mountain would later become a key part of this case based on his close interaction with both Chuco and Sporty, and the small fact that he claimed he seen Chuco carve the words Mexican Mafia on one of the cell's bars. You know, on one hand, it might seem like something that was insignificant when it happened, but in the context that it was used for, it became to be pretty devastating for Chuco. But I'll explain that later in the story. And I might as well say this now, but I don't know what compelled Mountain to flip and turn state evidence against Chuco, but my guess is that he either caught a case and was trying to get a reduction of time, or he just got to the point where he was tired and decided that he didn't want to play that game anymore. But whatever drove him to that point did, because he obviously decided that his career with the Aryan Brotherhood was over, and he was called in as a prosecution witness. Another individual who would also become to be a pivotal player in this case was an individual by the name of Martin Ibarra, who also went by Snoopy from Dogpatch. Snoopy actually had a more direct role in the planning, preparation, and procurement of the weapons that were supposed to be used to stab Bones. So even though he would also later cooperate and turn state evidence against Chuco, he was more complicit in the case. which gives good reason to believe that this is ultimately what compelled him to cooperate and turn state evidence for the federal ADA. So according to what he would later testify to, he was directed by Lucky to assist in this hit by not only sharpening two of the weapons that were going to be used to hit Bones, but also by procuring those weapons on the night before the incident was planned to take place. Snoopy worked in the prison paint shop where there was an abundance of weapon stock, and this is why Lucky had him assist in getting the weapons. Not only that, but he also had access to machinery that could be used to put razor sharp points and edges on these weapons as well. And this is exactly what I was telling you guys about earlier in the beginning of the story when I mentioned the prison's vocational programs and some of the industry jobs that they offer. These places are like godsends to some of these groups, and they depend on these resources to be readily available. As far as the second weapon, it was never clear as to why Snoopy was directed to give Chuco two weapons, but according to him, that's what he was told. I don't know if there was supposed to be a second shooter who was supposed to assist Chuco, or if he planned doing it double-fisted, but either way, Snoopy would later claim that he dropped off two weapons to Chuco on the night before the incident because that's what he was directed to do. At some point, when Lucky told Chuco that Snoopy was going to be the one providing him with the weapon, Chuco just wanted to touch base with him personally to make sure that they were both on the same page insofar as where the weapons were going to be dropped. Besides, he had known Snoopy since they had met a few years prior when they were both in the LA County jail, so he trusted him and he liked him. But for whatever reason, Chuco felt like he needed to brag and boast about what he was about to do to Snoopy as well. And this would be another mistake he would surely end up regretting later. So when he met up with Snoopy on the yard, Chuco basically told him that he was about to catch a body and that he was the designated shooter that was going to carry out the hit. Again, like I've said before, exposing this type of business is completely unnecessary and there's nothing positive to gain from it. You know, Chuco didn't know it yet, but he had already compromised the integrity of this assignment and his own security long before he had even dropped the body. You know, but unfortunately, there's a lot of us who end up making the same mistake. Not only because of the recognition and respect we want to attain from our own people, but more so because we think we can trust the wrong people. That's usually how it works. The ones we think we can trust are the first ones that end up burning us, and the ones who we think we can't trust are usually the ones who end up keeping it solid. You know, as far as Bones goes, believe it or not, prior to this incident, which obviously led to this investigation and him being in hot water, he appeared to be a highly respected and highly liked individual. Nobody had nothing bad to say about him, and from what I was able to gather, most of his people on that yard liked him. But like I said, in this game, when your number comes up and the crosshairs are turned on you, loyalty drops fast and your own people are the first ones to turn on you. I guarantee you that you won't find too many people that will argue with that fact. And if they do, it'll be a baseless argument with nothing to back it up. That's just how it works, and it's not like I'm telling you guys anything that you don't already know. It happens all the time. And 9 times out of 10, this is the type of betrayal that most of these stories end with. Individuals that end up being victimized by their own so-called brothers in arms. So according to my source, Lucky officially gave Chuco the directive to take Bones out 2 days before the incident on July 23rd, 1989. And apparently Chuco was told that Bones might be a potential target and that he was going to be the one given the assignment if he got confirmation that the allegations that were being made against him were true. But again, it didn't become official until Lucky stamped it and gave him the verbal go-ahead 2 days prior. Then on the 24th, the day before the incident, Lucky sat down with Chuco and went over all the intricate details of how the Mexican Mafia wanted this carried out. Since both Chuco and Bones worked in the kitchen as lead cooks and essentially only worked with a couple other inmates, Lucky told Chuco that he thought he'd have more of an advantage to carry this out while they were at work in the kitchen. And he explained several reasons for this. Based on prior conversations that Chuco and Lucky had, Lucky felt like Chuco had a better chance of completing the mission in a blind spot somewhere in the kitchen, and that the chances of outside interference were a lot more minimal. And according to my source, there was only 2 other inmate workers who would be present in the kitchen, and 2 other free staff who spent the majority of their time either out on the dock processing food carts for the different ranges, or in the office where they wouldn't have a vantage point to anything that was happening in the kitchen. And the 4 inmate lead cooks that were back there at that time basically had the run of the kitchen and did it with essentially no supervision at all. There was another area of the kitchen where a group of inmates worked worked in the bakery, but they rarely came into contact with these guys. Not only that, but Chuco knew the layout better than anyone and had been working back there for several months. Lucky also suggested that Chuco catch bones in one of the kitchen's blind spots, a few specific areas that they actually talked about. One was in the back where they spent most of their time cooking and stirring these massive pots of food. It was in the cuts and he'd have ample time to carry it out. The only problem about it that Lucky didn't like is that it was in a big open area, and this could have created potential problems with containment. From the sounds of it, Lucky was a pretty thorough thinker and tried to be as meticulous about planning this as he possibly could be. He wanted to make sure that Chuco had every advantage that he could think of in his favor, so formulating the right plan was crucial. Another potential area that they talked about was in a smaller room where all the freezers were located. If Chuco miscalculated and initiated the hit while somebody was in the office, chances are they would end up hearing the commotion, and this might interfere with completing the mission. The last option they discussed was the bathroom, and this was probably the best case scenario. It provided a small enclosed area for Chuco to do his work. It was obviously a blind spot, and it also gave Chuco a better advantage of getting the drop on bones and catching them by surprise. The only downside about it was if another inmate just so happened to use the bathroom while this was happening, but again, it was all about timing. Ultimately they agreed that Chuco would keep all these options in mind and just play it by ear once he was back there. Because to keep it real with you guys, these types of things can be planned out to the T, but sometimes something will happen that's completely unexpected and you have to come up with a contingency plan. So then all your planning becomes to be redundant and you basically have to wing it at that point. But it's always good to go over hypotheticals and have a backup plan though, because the chances of something unexpected happening are usually pretty high. From that point on, everything was pretty much planned out and ready to go. Lucky told Chuco that Snoopy from Dog Patch was going to be the one responsible for dropping off 2 bone crushers, flats with points on them ready to go, and that all he had to do was retrieve them. And Chuco was told that the weapons were going to be taped under one of the tables in the chow hall, so he didn't have to worry about being intercepted or getting them inside himself. All he had to do once he was ready in the kitchen was go to the drop point, retrieve the weapon, and then it was go time. So on the morning of the day when this hit was set to take place, Chuco couldn't stop thinking about all the different possibilities that could have potentially interfered with this assignment. He was almost in panic mode. An unexpected lockdown, something going wrong in the kitchen, someone who knew about it dropping a kite, etc., etc. He wanted this more than anything else in his life, and he had waited for this moment for years. In his mind, after everything he had ever worked for, it all came down to this. And now that it was finally staring him in the face, he didn't want anything to interfere with it or snatch it away. But up until it was time for him to go to work that day, he was so stressed out about the what ifs and the different possibilities that he was literally consumed with thinking about it. And then when it was finally time for him to go to work, his adrenaline levels were off the charts. He was pacing back and forth, amped up like he had just mainlined a shot of speed. But then when he finally got to the kitchen and set his sights on his target, he relaxed and settled into his normal rhythm. It was like the calm before the storm, and he realized that he had been worried for nothing. That morning basically played out like any other normal morning. The only difference is that he spent more time paying closer attention to Bones and his movements than he usually did. The other thing he did different came when it was time to fill the chow hall's coffee pots. One of the other workers usually did this as part of his normal daily routine, but Chuco utilized this opportunity so that he could access the chow hall and retrieve the weapon that Snoopy was supposed to have taped under one of the corner tables. So as it looked at that point, the first leg of this mission went without flaw. Now it was time to secure his weapon and figure out his best option of opportunity. So Chuco took 2 vats of hot coffee out to the chow hall and filled the coffee containers with fresh hot coffee. And then while he was out there, he went to the corner table that him and Snoopy agreed would serve as the designated weapon drop. When Chuco felt around on the bottom side of the table, he felt one of the weapons taped exactly where Snoopy said it would be. Then he inadvertently felt the handle of a second weapon that was also taped next to it. Again, I don't know what the significance or purpose was for providing him with the second weapon, but according to my source and what would come out later, Snoopy was told by Lucky to drop 2 weapons in the chow hall for Chuco that were both said to be used for this hit, and that's what he did. So after he managed to pull one of the weapons loose and look at it, it was a 7-inch flat with a nasty tip on it. It was definitely a bone crusher and the kind of weapon that could only be fashioned from using industrial grade grinders or machine shop equipment to make it. I've said this several times before in the past and I'll say it again. Some of the weapons that you see floating around on these prison yards, whether it's in state or federal prison, are about as close as the knives that you have in your kitchen drawer right now. They're nasty, and unless you've seen one or held one, you'll never really understand the true context of what I'm talking about from looking at pictures. And I'm not talking about the run-of-the-mill types of weapons that you see out there that are crudely made using a rough surface of concrete and water on your cell floor to hand file a point on it. I'm talking about the kinds of weapons that are made with heavy equipment by some of these guys who have some level of experience in machine shop. Weapons that would slide in and penetrate human flesh like a cube of butter. So despite the fact that there was 2 weapons, Chuco only took one and left the second one taped under the table where he found it. He put the one that he was going to use in his waistband, and then he went back into the kitchen where he was stationed. At this point, this was the second leg of the assignment, and once again, it went without flaw. So far, he was batting at 100%, but unfortunately for Chuco, and despite the fact that everything initially seemed to be going his way, things would eventually end up going all bad for him in the long run. So when Chuco went back into the main kitchen area where he worked and spent most of his time, Bones and the other 2 lead cooks were carrying on with their usual daily activities like they normally did every other day. Now it was just a matter of waiting for an opportunity to get the drop on Bones and either catch him slipping in the small freezer room that him and Lucky had talked about, or in the bathroom if he caught him by himself. Chuco thought about all the different scenarios him and Lucky talked about, and he tried his best to exercise some level of patience, but he was hyped up and he was ready to get this done. The last thing he wanted to do was to either jump the gun or make a brash decision based on his inability to be patient. Anyway, sometime around 11:30 a.m. on the morning of January 25th, 1989, Chuco saw 2 free staff workers enter the office area and shut the door. They usually did this around 1:30 p.m. and stayed there for the rest of the day, but on that day they did it early, and Chuco knew that this meant that it was go time. So for the next few minutes, Chuco actually considered just hitting Bones right there in the main kitchen area. However, the concerns him and Lucky talked about ended up holding him back. Then about 5 minutes after the free staff went into their office, Chuco caught a break. Out of nowhere, Bones unexpectedly headed for the bathroom. Chuco, on the other hand, couldn't believe it. This was as close to divine intervention that he could have expected. It was the perfect opportunity and the best case scenario that he could have hoped for. The free staff were tucked away in their office with the door shut, where they'd likely stay until shift change. The other inmate cooks were inside the kitchen prepping dinner for the entire facility, and as far as Chuco could tell, Bones was in the bathroom by himself. I don't want to get off topic, but this is the other thing about prison that I'm sure a lot of you already know, and something that Chuco himself was also about to learn as well. In any type of prison environment, because of the constant threat and the elevated level of awareness that most of these guys exercise, your surroundings can sometimes be deceptive. What I mean is this: before Chuco went into the bathroom, he obviously looked around and felt like the coast was clear. And he assumed this because he didn't physically see any other inmates or anyone else watching him. And I mean, in all fairness to him, you can only see what you can see and base your perception on that and that alone. But you can bet your bottom dollar on the fact that someone's usually always watching, or at least aware of where you're at and what you're doing in an environment like this. That's just what inmates do in prison. They watch and they look at everything that's going on around them. Well, at least the ones who are security conscious and who stay on their toes are. It's just part of people having an elevated level of awareness. You've got to remember, this is prison, where your survival or your ability to gauge or detect potential threats depends on it. From personal experience, I can tell you that that's what I used to do myself, especially when it came to some of our known enemies or the officers that would work in our blocks or units. We would watch and study their movements from the time they came in until they left at the end of their shifts. I knew what drawer they kept their pens in, where they stashed their lunches, where they kept their personal bag, etc., etc. And that's because I was always watching them, studying their movements and their everyday habits. It's also critical in building a personal profile and just gathering personal intel about things that might become important at some point. Where do you think all these prison stabbings or prison fight videos come from? They come from inmates or an officer that's in the cut watching somewhere. But my point in telling you guys all this is that even though you might not see someone watching you and you might think that you've got an open lane to do something like this, that's not always the case. And chances are there's always going to be someone watching. And unfortunately for Chuco, he would also end up finding this out himself, when several inmates would later come forward and testify about the circumstances and details of what they seen on the day of this incident. Needless to say, thinking that it was clear and that this was his perfect opportunity to go in on Bones, Chuco entered the bathroom and initiated the hit. When he walked into the bathroom, Bones had just finished up at one of the urinals and was already in the process of washing his hands at one of the bathroom sinks. And because these two knew each other and there was some level of comfort, Bones looked at Chuco in the reflection of one of the bathroom's mirrors and gave him a quick head nod before looking back down to finish washing his hands. And this was a critical point of contact, because had it been a northerner, a DC black, or another inmate that he didn't know, Bones probably would have watched him closer or paid more attention to what Chuco was doing when he walked inside the bathroom. But because he didn't, it was that one split second when Bones looked back down in the sink that gave Chuco the advantage that he needed. That was enough for him to get the drop on Bones and maintain the element of surprise that made the difference. Because as soon as Bones looked back down, Chuco reached in his waistband, and almost at the same time, he hit Bones on the side of his neck. And this caused Bones to freeze up for a minute. Not out of fear of retaliating or because he hesitated to defend himself, it was more so out of the state of shock he went into after he was mentally trying to digest what had just happened. And this is common, I've seen it happen before. Sometimes when a target gets hit, they'll freeze up and go into a state of confusion because they're trying to process what just happened, and it's a common reaction that you're just going to see sometimes. Other targets will defecate or urinate on themselves after they go into a deep state of fear. That's something else that I've seen happen as well. But everybody's different. Some guys are mentally adept to what's happening when it happens, and they'll start swinging back in defense mode as soon as they're hit. Unfortunately for Bones, he froze up, and this is something that Chuco sensed and took full advantage of. So after the first neck shot, which ended up being a fatal injury that entered the right side of Bones' neck and then exited on the left side, Chuco tried to hit him again in the neck, but ended up missing and catching him in the side of his head. And by now, Bones was probably well aware of what was happening and clearly felt his headshot. Nobody knows for sure, but based on an expert medical opinion, this was the second injury that Bones supposedly sustained, and it was more than likely the injury that caused him to collapse to the floor. Not from pain, but because of the blade penetrating Bones' skull and damaging the cerebrum portion of his brain. This is the primary portion of the brain in the back of the skull that controls balance, posture, and coordination. No doubt that this was a lucky hit and that Chuco wasn't specifically targeting this area of his brain, because it's just highly unlikely that he hit him with that kind of precision. But nonetheless, that's where he hit him. From that point on, Chuco went on to stab Bones a total of 56 times. He kept swinging until his arm was gassed out. So the medical examiner would later state in court that Bones sustained injuries to the neck, the head, the face, the arms, and the upper torso, and his back, more than likely when he was already on the floor, and in the hands, which were believed to be from defensive wounds. I'm sure that most of you have seen enough of these prison stabbings that were either recorded on contraband cell phones or from COs who recorded them themselves and then reposted them on social media to know that at some point when someone gets turned into a human pincushion like this, that there comes a point when they've been stabbed so many times that they can't even defend themselves or fend off the blows anymore. They just basically lay there and take it, and this is probably what ended up happening to Bones at some point. So after Chuco had stabbed Bones 56 times and was sure he was gone, he exited the bathroom and dropped the weapon in one of the kitchen sinks. And it was at this point that Chuco apparently realized that he was covered with Bones' blood and that he couldn't possibly walk out of the chow hall like that without drawing some type of unwanted attention. If you guys circle back to the beginning of the story when several witnesses would come forward and implicate Chuco as being involved in this homicide, they said that they seen Chuco enter the bathroom after Bones, and that a few minutes later he came out, dropped a metal object into one of the kitchen sinks, and then proceeded to wash a large piece of clothing that appeared to have had a copious amount of blood on it. I'll go back to this in a little bit, but these statements that were made by some of the witnesses ended up being a crucial part of what ended up leading to Chuco's conviction. Because obviously in a case like this, where other known convicted felons are considered to be your star witnesses, their credibility is definitely going to come into question, and the attorneys are going to jump on this. At any rate, the large piece of clothing that Chuco was seen washing in the sink was allegedly his top shirt and his t-shirt that were both covered in blood. And even though Chuco used soap and did his best to wash these articles of clothing, the criminologist was still able to pull DNA profiles off of both of them. One profile was obviously Bones, and the other profile fit Chuco's, where again they indicated that he couldn't be excluded from less than 2% of the entire population. And Chuco more than likely cut himself when he was stabbing Bones. That's how his blood was probably transferred onto his clothing. So I'm not going to dissect the whole case and tell you guys what happened in court play by play like I sometimes will in these stories. But what I will tell you guys, if you haven't already figured it out, is that both Carlos Sanchez, Sporty from Chicago, and Martin Ibarra, Snoopy from Dogpatch, both ended up implicating Chuco in this homicide. And again, I don't know what the terms of their deals were or what they were promised, but I'd be willing to bet that it was either a reduction of time or consideration for new charges that they might have caught. They definitely got something because both of them agreed to come in as prosecution witnesses. And another inmate that also came in and testified about what he claimed he knew was this Wood, Courtney Murray, mountain from Ventura County, who claimed that he was affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood. He basically came in and testified that he physically seen Chuco carve the words Mexican Mafia on his cell's bars, and that Chuco basically told him that he was in the process of being made. Unfortunately for Chuco, that's how Mountain paid him back for embracing him and looking out for him after he hit the yard. Snoopy and Sporty, on the other hand, not only implicated Chuco, but they also implicated George Bustamante, Lucky from Boyle Heights as well. They claimed that he was the one who gave Chuco the directive to take Bones out, and that Lucky was also in the process of recruiting him into the Mexican Mafia, that this body was basically Chuco's christening into the organization, and that this was his passage in. And like I was telling you guys, based on the fact that Sporty, Snoopy, Mountain, and 3 other inmates that were in the kitchen at the time of the homicide were all convicted felons who had previously been involved in criminal malfeasance themselves, one of Chuco's attorney's main points of contention was that these guys didn't have any credibility. And to be honest, a lot of juries will really take this into consideration. Convicted felons aren't exactly the best candidates that are known for telling the truth. But the federal 88 had one final trick up his sleeve, and it was kind of hard to be refuted. They claimed that all the inmates that were involved in this case received a copy of the incident report, and that in the report they included the fact that several of these inmates claimed that they physically seen Chuco throw a metal object in one of the kitchen sinks, and that furthermore they also heard it. But they didn't specify what sink it was. That was a detail that wasn't released to anyone. So when the witnesses came in and testified as a trier of fact or to see if they were fabricating, they showed a diagram of the kitchen with all the sinks in it and had each one of the witnesses point to what sink it was that they claimed they seen Chuco throw the weapon in, and they all pointed to the right sink. This was a turning point and somewhat of a smoking gun that kind of sunk Chuco. So there you have it, another story about a Mexican Mafia prospect who lost his freedom based on the fact that his only real purpose in life was to become a made member. To do that, he was required to make an ultimate sacrifice by spilling blood and taking a life. Unfortunately for him, his so-called christening into the Mexican Mafia ended up being his christening for a life sentence in federal prison. And one of the other common denominators about this story from others that I've told you guys about in the past has to do with someone else who made the mistake of bragging, boasting, or talking about criminal activity that they've been involved in for no other reason other than to gain recognition or to give themselves credibility that they don't need to prove to anyone. Because again, you guys see that nothing good ever comes of it, and that it always comes back to hurt you in the long run. You know, I know Chuco and Sporty were close and established a strong bond over the course of time, but at some point when Sporty kept asking about this body that Chuco was supposed to be dropping, red flags should have started popping up, and this should have made him suspicious. Because regardless of how much someone tries talking to you about a homicide that they're supposed to be involved in, normally individuals that have been involved in the game and know better will usually tell you that they don't want to hear about the details of something like that, and that the less that they know, the better it is for them. And that's done with their own best interest in mind, because if they don't know about something like that happening, then they can't be included in the circle of potential people or the possibilities of people that might later be suspect of telling. You know, with all due respect to Chuco, I know he probably invested all this trust in Sporty because Sporty was claiming to be an aspiring prospect for the Mexican Mafia himself, and he obviously thought he had an unbreakable bond. But like I said earlier on in the beginning of the story, the people that end up burning you are usually the ones who you think you can trust. But on the flip side, it's the ones that you think are gonna burn you that end up holding you down. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm gonna continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're advised whenever I drop any content on the channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support, and also for continuing to tap into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.